What's up, guys? Well, they're coming thick and fast now. We've got another one for you, and right now it's the turn of Red Bull's RB15, which has dropped today. An impressive looking car. I guess we thought it would be. Aerodynamically, Red Bull always push the boundaries. They always come up with interesting solutions to problems, and this one at this stage looks no different. There are some quite interesting little design details that I'm going to point out to you now. Interestingly, they launched their car without, not a digital render, but they launched it with studio shots of the actual car, which is a rarity these days. And then very quickly, a bit like Mercedes, in fact, at the same track, on the same day as Mercedes, they rolled their car out at Silverstone. So the initial images that were released in their launch format, if you like, bear very, very good resemblance to the actual car. And I've got a few shots that have since been released of the car on track to show you as well. But let's get into it then. Some really nice ideas and solutions to some of the challenges that the new regulations throw up, as I said. The front wing, let's start with that as we have with the others. This is a more, I guess, I want to say traditional, but there's no such thing as a traditional concept here because it's a brand new front wing set of regs. But a little bit like the Mercedes, they have chosen to use pretty much all of the box section, the allowed box section within the regulations to generate downforce, maximising the front downforce, which again tells us that they must be able to replicate that, or at least balance that towards the rear of the car, potentially using the diffuser and the underfloor. The high rake concept, which I'll show you in a moment, continues with this car. So if they can pull loads of downforce from the rear and generate as much as they can on the front, the overall downforce goes up, but the balance stays well balanced front to rear, and that helps with things like tyre life. It helps with the overall mechanical balance of the car as well, and from the driver's perspective, it's much easier to drive. So, utilising every bit of space inside this box section here, unlike some of the others, they've chosen to drop down the top three elements to a point. Now, I think, who was it? Was it the Haas, I think, had a similar kind of solution to this, where these top three all meet, all converge at this point here, very close. And that's about generating the inboard tip, the Y250 vortex we keep hearing about. The inboard tip vortex that spins off each one of these elements. Being all bunched up and close to each other, they all draw together with the vortex that's generated through this little small arced section here, between the neutral part of the wing that's mandated in the middle and then the team's free section on the end. Utilising this section to spin up a vortex, that all these vortexes all merge together to create a great big spinning channel of air that will pass down through, and then we'll get onto that bargeboard section, which, my goodness, that has got some detail to it on this particular car. But that's what's going to pick up this massive vortex spinning off these inboard tips, channeling through here. That's the way they've gone with this particular section of the wing. The separators, or the support stays, all meticulously and deliberately in a line there, and all angled in a certain way to help aid the airflow off in that direction. And you can easily see here that the support brackets on this side and the front wing flap adjuster very clearly angled outward, as is the end plate. A little bit more outwash than we've seen on other cars. On the Mercedes, that was actually tilted in ever so slightly at the trailing edge of their end plate. This is much more as we thought it would probably be, a much more diluted version of what we've become used to over the last few years, but still trying to generate outwash. And it's even quite obvious to see on this particular car what they're trying to do: steer that airflow away from the front tyre, pulling that horribly messy turbulent airflow away from the tyre and away from the sections of the floor further back from the car. If we can get the messy turbulent wake away from the car, it doesn't interfere with the more intricate parts of the aerodynamic surfaces further back. So that's what the idea is all about. The regulations have tried to minimise the team's ability to control or to outwash that airflow coming off the back of this spinning tyre. The teams, as they always do, will try and fight back. They'll try and claw back some of that ability that's been taken away from them in the regulations. But that's how they've done it on this particular car. They've used I guess a diluted version of what we've become used to. The two strakes, only two strakes allowed now underneath the wing, whereas before we had many of those. But these two strakes, although we can't see on the picture, again have a slight outwash effect to them, all in aid of trying to pull that airflow away. They've stuck with their snorkel concept on the front that we don't see on any other cars, or many other cars, but Red Bull have been using for some time now. Wide pillars on the front here, all trying to generate or drive airflow through the underside of the nose, and a kind of cape section running down the back, the side here of the nose, which you'll see better from a side profile picture, but all designed to collect up this airflow and force it through to this centre section where most of the real intricate work really starts to happen as we move backwards. What you can see from this particular image, we'll get into it a bit more detail, but you can see that the suspension elements slightly different to some of the other arrangements here, and unlike the Mercedes where they really raised up the top of the top front wishbone, what Red Bull have done is raised up the lower front wishbone as much as they can. Look how high it is up the upright, and that's to try and give this big channel of clear air underneath the suspension, which can then be worked by the barge boards. A huge gap, all this space here to drive as much clear free stream air, and this big vortex that I talked about coming off here, which will start to channel through this and immediately hit these now slightly further forward barge boards than last year. But they've got a much clearer space to do that, a much freer run through with this lower wishbone raised this high up, about halfway up the wheel rim, or halfway up the upright, that looks to be. So a slightly different solution to some of the others, but that's the thinking behind it. One of the other things you can see quite clearly here, and this is something that everybody's been raising an eyebrow at, and I love little details like this that are just a little bit different. We've got an S-duct. Now there's nothing new about an S-duct, but what Red Bull have done here is they've put almost another winglet, or what looks like an almost reverse outlet on the top there. I've got a theory on what I think it might be doing, but it is just a guess at this point. But I think it might just be a shroud, almost like a winglet running across here, just trying to gather up airflow running along the top surface of the nose and speed it up before it then meets with the airflow that's returning or coming out of the more traditional S-duct that's behind that. So the S-duct that picks airflow up from the underside of the nose cone here feeds it through an S-shaped duct inside the nose and then out onto the top surface of the chassis. It's all there to try and keep the airflow attached to the top of the chassis, so that energised airflow will enable the airflow rising up the nose. Instead of detaching at the point where the nose cone rises up and then levels out, the S-duct is designed to try and keep that airflow attached, so a high energy burst of air being injected along the top surface, keeping the attachment. Well, if this little winglet here is generating a very narrow channel where we're squeezing airflow through that narrow channel, speeding it up, it actually puts a bit more energy into the airflow coming out of the S-duct, perhaps helping to draw high-speed airflow from that S-duct as well. I imagine just all in aid of trying to make that effect more powerful in keeping the airflow attached on the top surface. Okay, as we spin it round ever so slightly and look at it from an angle, you can see just here looks like where the inlet for the S-duct is. I imagine that's what it is. It's a very small, almost nacreduct style duct on the side. I'm presuming there's one on the other side as well, collecting airflow, sending it through the inside of the nose, around an S-shaped duct, and then out here. Hopefully, I imagine, or at least I'm guessing, being met by this potentially sped up airflow underneath that winglet. Quite an interesting take though. I quite like the fact they've done something a little bit different with it. We've got this cape here. It's not quite a full-on cape like the one we see on the Mercedes, but it is doing a similar kind of effect, just gathering up airflow, squeezing it in towards this centre section. And then we get into the barge board area in a moment, where you can see lots and lots of detailed work going on to manage that airflow that's being forced, almost shoveled through this section, which can then be worked through here and channeled off to the areas towards the rear. One little detail I spotted that really makes me 100% sure this is not a digital render and it is a studio shot. You can even see around these panels, around the top wishbone, there's a little infill panel here. This has got Adrian Newey written all over it. There's even helicopter tape, see-through clear tape, just taping over the join in the bodywork around this infill panel and the actual chassis itself, just to try and smooth the join, make sure there's absolutely no step. And those shut lines are almost perfect anyway, but Adrian Newey will have you seal over those just to be sure. I mean, it'll be holding the panel on, I'm sure, but it's also sealing up any gaps around that panel. They have also managed to incorporate a similar style, what we called a boomerang wing last year, didn't we? This great big long, almost boomerang shaped winglet, which last year was much further up here, if you remember. With the new regulations pushing the barge boards down and further forward, they've still managed to incorporate it, but now it runs all the way along and out to this point, this flick up, or this vertical strake on the side or leading edge of the floor. And that will be doing a number of things. It's got some various twists and turns, very deliberate profiling in it, but that long surface there gives the airflow a long path to travel under control. And that's the point. The point is that when you've got bodywork, wherever you've got surface area, you enable yourselves to control that airflow. As soon as you've got nothing in a space, the airflow then, if you want to control that airflow, then you've got to do it by energizing it, by spinning it into a vortex to keep it down a path that you want it to travel. So if you can put a really long strake like this, it has a long surface area for the airflow to be able to follow, and that just gives you more scope to keep it under control for further along the length of the car. So that will be helping to do that. We're helping to divide and divert airflow, some of it at this point perhaps up towards the inlets of the intake on the side pod, but most of all channeling it down along the side of the floor, along or around the bodywork, into that Coke bottle area that we'll get onto in a moment. Lots of serrations, lots of split parts to the barge board, lots of detail in there. The splits, the serrations are all about trying to minimise drag. It's about spinning up each one of those serrated elements will spin up its own little vortex, which will all then merge together to form a much more powerful vortex. I mean, the other big function of all of this bargeboard area is, of course, to protect these sensitive parts of the car from this front tyre wake, and some of these vertical strakes, and in fact what these uprights, little serrated uprights here will be doing, is helping to drag away this messy spinning vortex, this spinning wake, messy turbulent area of airflow coming off the back of this tyre. Lots of these little details here will be spinning up this powerful vortex, which will help to drag away this horrible messy air. So it's all there for a reason. Every single one of those tiny bit of little bits of carbon fibre detail are all having a specific effect, but they all work in conjunction with each other to form this really powerful effect in whatever it is they're trying to do. Red Bull have got a tiny inlet here, which will tell you something about the Honda's cooling requirements. Now, when Honda and Red Bull came together, there will have been lots of discussions about Red Bull's demands, Red Bull's aero demands, and having Honda be able to accommodate those. And when I talk about that, I mean Adrian Newey and his team will want to shrink the bodywork down in the most tight fashion. You know, it's all about aero with Adrian Newey. I remember being in a garage when I was working with Adrian. I remember being one day frustrated by something, I can't remember what it was, something I was trying to fit onto a car, a brake duct or a barge board or something. I remember turning to Adrian Newey, who was stood behind me, and I said, Adrian, I said, how much of the design process when you're sitting at your drawing board, as a percentage, just give me a rough idea, how much of that goes into practicality of being able to work with these things, being able to fit them or service them? And he turned around in a deadpan face and just said, none. And he was serious. You know, his whole focus is about aerodynamic performance, and everybody else has to accommodate that, has to fit in line with that. So when he says he wants to shrink the bodywork into this immensely tight format, people like Honda, the suspension guys, the gearbox guys, they all have to accommodate that somehow. And that's what they've done here with this cooling inlet here. Very, very narrow, small channel, very, very high up, like some of the other teams. The crash structure or side impact structure that every team has to have sticking out from the side of the chassis to protect against a side impact, or protect the driver against a side impact, being used here for aerodynamic gain. So that will be helping drive airflow into that channel, into that duct, but it also extends out to this upright here, which will help divert the airflow down and following the path of that really, really slim bodywork towards the rear. The floor, very similar in concept to actually what we saw from Mercedes earlier. Tyre squirt, diagonal tyre squirt slots right at the back just before the rear tyre, trying to protect that messy tyre squirt from squirting off underneath the car, trying to protect it and drive it away from the sensitive diffuser area. Longitudinal slots along here, all designed to try and seal the edge of the floor. This is a high rake car, as I mentioned, like they've had before, high rake concept. So the more they can protect the underfloor aerodynamics using some of this spinning vortices coming off the side through these slot gaps here, then the better performing the underfloor and the diffuser will be. So very, very similar in concept to the Mercedes at that point. And then let's just look at this Coke bottle area here, incredibly slim. This is as narrow as I think I've seen it. The front of the side pod is very different to most others because they don't have a huge undercut at the forward part of the side pod, but at the rear it slims in beyond belief. How they've managed to squeeze a gearbox and everything else in that space, I have no idea. The silver rod that you can see there is the rear suspension pull rod, running farther forward, and that's partly why they do this. That pull rod runs very far forward to the front of the gearbox where it will meet the rocker. You know, lots of other teams will have it running in a much more sort of parallel with the rear axle line, but that means you've got to have your rockers then and your dampers and all the other paraphernalia much further back. By putting it much further forward here, it allows more space behind that to shrink that bodywork in even more. So all just little details, all driving towards the optimum aerodynamic shape that they can possibly achieve. Rear wing looks relatively standard, as we've seen with lots of the cars. Some vertical strakes or hanging sections off the back, again to start minimising drag in the transition between the narrow part of the wing and the wider part. I've got a couple of pics of the car on track to show you now, and it will highlight the rake angle of the car as well. Let's have a quick look at those. This is a great shot because we can see the rake, the high rake at the rear of the car. I mean, look at that, you can crawl underneath that. That's an enormous rake angle, which Red Bull just have so much expertise in making work. And as I touched on the other day with the Renault car, it's not just about jacking up the rear of the car. That's not how this works. The whole design concept has to be focused on that. So the front wing and everything rearward of that, because of the angle that the car's sitting at, has to be designed with that in mind. It's about accelerating airflow underneath the front splitter, or the front wing and then the splitter, maximising the effect of the diffuser, essentially generating or turning the entire underfloor into one extended diffuser, which just generates more and more downforce, more and more efficiency, and in the end starts to minimise the drag coming off the rear of the car too. We can really see some of the detail around here, and just look at the wing mirrors, something else that I really like, a little bit like the Ferrari style that we had last year where they've got a shroud around the actual wing mirror, but this even more complex than Ferrari had. Lots of work going on here, all just designed to start keeping control of that airflow. The stays, all again being used for aerodynamic benefit. A very, very horizontal winglet coming all the way out here. That'll have a slight downturn to it to drive airflow down onto the bodywork and into this section. You can really see how much of a gap we've got in here because that rear end is just so shrunk in. Really, really impressive stuff. But little details like these mirrors, really quite impressive. Just shows the lengths. Every single piece that's on these cars has a purpose. You know, the wing mirrors are no longer just for looking in to see what's behind you. They form an aerodynamic part of the car, and you can see how much work has gone into these, how much focus has been put on them. Really, really impressive stuff. Right, just looking at this shot from the rear again, you can just see how much work has gone on in this particular section around the barge boards. Really nice sculpted horizontal veins coming off the chassis. You can see what they're doing. They're all designed to drive this airflow down here. The barge board with an aggressive angle to pull away this front tyre wake. The messy air coming off this rotating, turning, bouncing, moving wheel that's very difficult to control now has to be picked up by the barge board and thrown outboard away from the floor. Even more important on a high rake car like this, because you've got such a big gap between the floor and the rear of the floor and the racetrack here, that if this messy weight wasn't dealt with at this point, it would start spilling under here. It would start really interacting with the floor, which would just take away any efficiency, any performance that you might be able to generate from it. So this area, this is probably why it's so complex on this car, because it becomes even more important with this style of high rake concept. You can see the exhaust now has a single pillar mounting the rear wing. At the top of there is the DRS actuator, but just look how slim and snug fit it is around the exhaust tailpipe. I mean, that they've got something clever going on there to prevent that from overheating, because there is absolutely no air gap around that. And that allows the bodywork to be shrunk in around it as well. The wastegate pipes look a little bit lower than the installation that we saw on the Toro Rosso. Of course, same engine in the Toro Rosso, but a very slightly different layout in terms of where the wastegate pipes exit. You can see the gold tape. That will be 24 karat gold tape around the inboard ends of the upper wishbones, just to protect against the heat coming off that, to stop the carbon fibre from delaminating. So some really nice details on this car. You can see on this picture the rear wing end plate lights that we've got new for 2019. So those lights will start to be used over the course of the 2019 season, particularly in poor wet visibility. When it's heavy rain, research has shown that this is easier for following drivers to see than the more traditional centre light that we have down here. Nice little details on the back of the diffuser. You can even clearly see the multiple slots running horizontally across here, but a nice little flick up detail as well, all there to try and increase the upwash from the diffuser, to increase that power and that performance that the diffuser can provide for them. So some really lovely stuff. I really like the look of this car. I knew I would. I love the livery as well, by the way. Just a temporary livery. This is not the livery we're going to see when it comes to racing, but I quite like the fact that Red Bull do this for testing. It hides some of the details, but it's also quite striking and gets a bit of coverage too. So really nice stuff. Really like it. Let me know what you think. I think of all the technical details on this, probably my favourite so far.